Last week, 3 part-time developers launched a Kickstarter for an RTS game and hit their $85,000 funding goal in under 14 hours. The trailer had mistakes in it. Some of the features they wanted to show off weren't finished. They launched it anyway, and it funded before most of them got home from their day jobs. The game is D.O.R.F. Real-Time Strategic Conflict, an isometric base-building RTS with 3 asymmetric factions, resource logistics, land, air and sea combat, destructible environments, and individual campaigns for each side. It's been built over years on personal savings and a modestly funded Patreon. We'll come back to why you should support this game, but first let's talk about how we got here. The story of D.O.R.F. starts with a sketchpad. In 2010, John Williams was drawing pictures in college of dwarfish metal slug soldiers driving goofy tanks, wasteland warriors in ridiculous Mad Max cars, and dieselpunk troopers pouring out of massive sci-fi tripods. He wanted to build an RTS game, but the game he had in his head was specific. It wasn't Command & Conquer reskinned, it wasn't StarCraft with new sprites, it was its own thing with its own world, and the problem was that he had no way to make it. Williams is a trained 3D artist. He can model, animate and render, but he can't program. He tried Unity at one point during his studies and it went nowhere. For the better part of a decade, the game existed as an ever-expanding series of concept art for something that couldn't be built. The RTS genre was in decline, the games industry looked increasingly hostile to work in, and without programmability there was no path from concept to product. That changed in 2019 when Williams found OpenRA, the open source community recreation of the classic Command & Conquer games. But the context of how we got there is important, because Williams wasn't just someone who played CNC and thought it would be fun to make his own version. He was already deep in the CNC modding community, building total conversion mods that pushed the original engines to breaking point. Dawn of the Tiberium Age merged the original Command & Conquer and Red Alert into a single cohesive game with multiple campaign routes, new artwork and mission variants that could radically change the storyline based on player choices. Combined Arms was even more ambitious, pulling factions and units from across the entire CNC franchise into 5 playable sides with their own sub-factions. Both mods were massive in scope, both were well regarded in the community, and both ran directly into the hard limitations of the engines they were built on. Williams had taken 2 different CNC engines as far as they could go, and still couldn't make the game he wanted. OpenRA was the next step. It's written in C# and GPL licensed, and it's designed to be moddable. Williams saw it and realised it was a viable platform to build a commercial game. He didn't immediately think, I'll make my dream game. It started as a mod, something he was doing for fun in his spare time, with no commercial ambitions attached to it. The turning point came in 2021 when Williams started talking to Thomas Van Leth, one of the programmers already doing development work on the OpenRA project. Tommy agreed to build new systems for the game that a non-programmer could never implement on their own. Things like animated unit portraits, reworked attack logic that allowed vehicles to have multiple independently targeting turrets, and indoor fighting for garrison troops. From that point, the scope expanded from a hobby mod into a serious attempt at a standalone commercial RTS. It was Tommy who pushed for the logistics system. In a conversation about the game's resource mechanics, he pointed out that RTS games almost never include logistics despite being based on military conflict. That observation became the foundation of what makes D.O.R.F. different from every other CNC-inspired project. Resources don't sit in an abstract pool that factories can pull from. They have to be physically moved from refineries to production buildings using forklifts, conveyor belts and pipelines. Your base layout becomes a tactical decision because the efficiency of your supply chain directly affects your ability to produce units. Williams was open about the financial reality in a podcast interview back in 2022. He'd been paying Tommy out of pocket from his own savings while working on the art himself in something he described a bit awkwardly as a sabbatical. The Patreon launched around that time because people kept asking how to support the project and Williams kept putting them off, thinking the game wasn't presentable enough. He eventually threw together what he called a not very good trailer from random gameplay footage in Sony Vegas and put it up just to have something. A third developer, Gustas Kazukaukas, joined in late 2023 and started working on optimization and performance. He took over finishing the dynamic lighting system when Tommy had to step away from development for a period. That lighting system, along with a custom shader that lets 2D sprites rotate as if they're 3D objects and interact with real-time light sources, has been one of the reasons the project went quiet for nearly a year. The old art assets were incompatible with the new rendering, so Williams stopped making new content until the system was finished. From the outside it looked like the project had stalled. From the inside they were rebuilding the visual foundation of the entire game. That brings us to 2026 and a Kickstarter campaign that the developers launched while apologising for the trailer having mistakes in it. 15 years from sketchpad to crowdfunding, that's either stubbornness or conviction, and at this point the distinction probably doesn't matter. There's 3 factions in the game. The Union of Imperial States is a confederation of industrialists, aristocrats and military nobility occupying a vast northern territory connected by factories and rail lines, heavy armour, artillery, concrete superfortresses and colossal vehicles. Think Soviet brutalism with the serial numbers filed off. They're powerful but decaying, losing ground to raiders, corruption and dwindling resources. A faction on borrowed time with the firepower to take everyone else down with them. The warband tribes are the barbarians, nomads, cults, seafaring pirates and motorised warbands spread across huge stretches of territory. They fight each other more than they fight everyone else. They're considered too primitive to be a real threat by the other factions, and they build their war machines from the scrap of the old world. They don't get conventional aircraft or a proper navy. Instead they get stealth, ambush tactics, guerrilla warfare and underground tunnel networks. If a single warlord united them, the other factions would have a serious problem. The Triple Consortium, or the Collective, is the Tech faction, a conglomeration of private enterprises and militias that recovered old world technology and turned themselves into the most advanced fighting force on the planet. Mobile refineries, walking structures, the best trained soldiers on the continent, and a rumoured connection to true humans who may be planning to retake the planet. They attack and retreat from territories seemingly at random, and their long-term goals are unknown to the factions. What makes these factions interesting beyond the lore is the asymmetry in how they play. The warbands can't call in airstrikes like the other 2 factions. They compensate with support powers, stealth units and the tunnel system. The Empire's Maximus heavy tank is essentially a landship with howitzers, anti-tank cannons, autocannons and machine guns mounted on separate independently rotating turrets. The Collective's monowheel assault cycles are fast reconnaissance units armed with micro-missiles that can swarm heavier vehicles. Warband buggers can tow different trailer attachments to change their battlefield role on the fly, from anti-air platforms to mobile rocket artillery to flamethrower units. This is creative unit design with personality behind it, not 3 rosters of functionally identical units wearing different coloured hats. And then there are the wretch chuckers. These are warband infantry who carry a collection of small deformed humanoids strapped with explosives on their backs and hurl them at tanks and fortifications. The game's description notes it's unknown whether the wretches are malformed humans or some kind of inhuman creature, and it's similarly mysterious why they're so eager to throw themselves to their doom, although given their unfortunate nature and appearance it does seem quite reasonable. That's the tone of the game. Dark, weird and funny about it. The resource system runs deeper than the standard RTS model. There are 5 resource types: materials and fuel, which come from harvesting junk and crude oil respectively; population, which works as a recruitment supply line where reinforcements arrive from off map and need to physically travel to your production buildings; authority, which is earned from killing enemies and completing objectives and can be spent on airstrikes and support powers; and power, which functions like the classic CNC power grid. Being low on one resource doesn't cripple you because the others still give you options. Low on materials but heavy on recruits, mass infantry, plenty of fuel, build vehicles, short on everything but sitting on authority, calling airstrikes. The logistics layer ties all of this together. Forklifts move refined resources between buildings, pipelines connect oil extractors to refineries to fuel silos. Recruit reinforcements need a route from the map edge to your production buildings, and that route can be attacked. Your base layout is a logistical puzzle on top of being a defensive one. The developers have spent considerable time automating enough of this process that it feels engaging without being tedious, borrowing the philosophy from Supreme Commander where the interface handles the busy work so the player can focus on decisions. Naval Combat is where Williams' modding experience connects most directly to D.O.R.F's design. In December 2025 he wrote a detailed post about building naval combat that doesn't suck, and he started by criticising the naval systems in Dawn of the Tiberium Age and Combined Arms, his own mods. He described ships clipping through each other's sprites, firing single weapons from a single turret, gameplay degenerating into swarms of slow-moving boats. The Tiberian Sun engine couldn't handle multi-weapon targeting or limited turret traverse. The OpenRA engine added its own problems with instant acceleration and fire-on-the-move logic that made fast post dominant and submarines either useless or game-breakingly overpowered depending on which side of the screen you were on. He pushed 2 engines to the limits and broke both in the same place, Naval Combat. D.O.R.F's entire approach to water warfare was designed around fixing that. D.O.R.F's solution started with the engine work Tommy did reworking OpenRA's vehicle attack code from the ground up. Ships can now have multiple weapons bound to separate turrets, each with limited traverse and independent targeting. The Empire's destroyer carries 3 double-barreled autocannon turrets, 2 side-mounted autocannons, a torpedo launcher, an anti-missile turret, and potentially surface-to-air and surface-to-surface missiles. That's one ship. Units also have properly scaled collision boxes so warships look and move like warships instead of speedboats with large sprites painted over them. The design philosophy Williams outlined is straightforward. Naval units should be expensive, powerful, and individually significant. Deploying a warship should change the course of a battle. Losing one should feel like an event. Each faction gets enough variety that naval-only maps work as a legitimate way to play, with light patrol craft, anti-air vessels, bombardment ships, submarines and logistics vessels. The warbands, consistent with their asymmetric design, don't get capital ships. Their navy focuses on speed and subterfuge with smaller vessels. Beyond the ships themselves, water interacts with the rest of the game's systems in ways that go further than any RTS I'm aware of. Transport routes get an automated system borrowed from Supreme Commander's design philosophy, so you're not micromanaging landing craft back and forth. Naval cargo units move resources between bases across water. Recruit reinforcements and island maps arrive by transport ship, and the water itself is partially simulated, with dynamic water levels that can change if you destroy the terrain surrounding a reservoir. Blow a hole in a dam and the water drains and flows across the map tile by tile. The developers built this using modified versions of the flow simulation logic they'd already created for their pipeline system, which is the kind of efficient engineering you get from a small team that can't afford to build anything twice. All of this runs on the heavily modified OpenRA fork with the lighting and 3D sprite system we covered earlier. The visual result lands somewhere between the classic isometric look of Tiberian Sun and something considerably more modern. Williams has said that Tiberian Sun is probably the single biggest influence on D.O.R.F's atmosphere, and you can see it in the washed out colour palette and industrial aesthetic, but the technology underneath is pushing well past what any classic isometric RTS could do. 3 campaigns, 1 per faction, online multiplayer for up to 8 players, skirmish against AI, a map editor that ships with the game, full modding support with the engine source code released publicly under GPL. Planned platforms are Windows, Mac and Linux, with Steam and GOG as storefronts. 3 developers, part-time until this Kickstarter. The project release date is 2028. In his 2022 podcast interview, Williams estimated 2 more years. That was 3.5 years ago, and the game isn't finished. The scope has grown considerably since then, with the lighting overhaul, the 3D sprite system, the physics-based movement, and the addition of features that weren't on the table when the project was a mod. The communication has been minimal. 1 blog post on the website since 2023. 3 entries on the Steam News Hub across the entire life of the project. Long stretches of public silence while the team worked on internal systems. The Kickstarter launched without a corresponding Steam News announcement. That's leaving money on the table. There are people in the Steam discussions who assumed the project was dead because they hadn't heard anything for months. The developers have acknowledged this and promised monthly development updates going forward, which is the right call, but it's also a promise that needs to be kept. RTS Kickstarters carry a specific kind of risk that anyone who backs Stormgate will recognise. Ambitious promises, passionate developers and strong early funding don't guarantee a finished product. The scope of what D.O.R.F is attempting, 3 full campaigns, multiplayer, naval combat, a logistics system, destructible environments, modding tools, all built by 3 people on a modified open source engine, is enormous. The developers say that most of the critical systems are 90% complete and that the bulk of the remaining work is content creation, art assets, maps and campaigns. That's encouraging, but 90% complete in game development often means 50% of the work remains. This is a bet. The Kickstarter response suggests that a lot of people think it's a good bet, but it's still a bet, and anyone backing it should understand that. Here's why that bet is worth making. The RTS genre right now is in a strange position. There's clearly an audience for it. Tempest Rising launched in 2025 and proved that people will buy a base building RTS in the current market. But Tempest Rising also caught criticism from the community for playing it too safe, for feeling like a complete recreation of something that already existed without enough identity of its own. The developers openly stated they were paying homage to Command & Conquer, and a portion of the audience looked at the result and said, this is just C&C with less personality. That's the clone trap, and it's been killing in the RTS projects for years. John Williams identified that problem before D.O.R.F had a single playable unit. In 2022, on a podcast that about 4 people listened to, he said, I wouldn't want anyone to play this game and feel like, why am I playing this? I could just play C&C. That concern has shaped every decision in the game. The logistics system exists because Tommy pointed out that RTS games ignore one of the most fundamental aspects of warfare. The warbands don't have air power because giving every faction the same unit types is lazy design. The resource system has 5 layers because a single resource type doesn't create interesting decisions. None of this was designed by committee or dictated by a publisher's marketing department. It came from 2 people having conversations about what was missing from the games they loved. The major publishers have abandoned the genre. EA killed Generals 2 and hasn't touched Command & Conquer since. Blizzard isn't making RTS games. The few big budget attempts that have appeared in recent years haven't delivered. And here are 3 people from the C&C modern community, the same community that kept Zero Hour alive for 20 years, building something with more mechanical ambition than any studio with 100 employees has attempted in the genre recently. What separates D.O.R.F from the long list of indie RTS projects that reference the classics and then deliver a pale imitation is that Williams already tried making those classic formulas work as well as they possibly could. He spent years pushing 2 separate CNC mods to the absolute limits of their engines, documented exactly where and why they broke down, and then designed D.O.R.F specifically to solve those problems. The Naval Combat system exists because he watched his own ships clip through each other in DTA and said, this needs to be fundamentally different. The multi-turret attack logic exists because OpenRA's single weapon per unit system couldn't represent a warship properly. The logistics system exists because Tommy looked at the standard CNC resource model and asked why RTS games ignore the single most important factor in real warfare. Every mechanical decision in this game traces back to a specific frustration with how things worked before. The Kickstarter funded in 14 hours. The developers were worried the trailer wasn't good enough. They're honouring Patreon backers from the early days by matching their contributions to equivalent Kickstarter reward tiers. All 8 of the limited $1,000 design your own unit slots were gone within hours of the campaign going live. These are not people chasing a trend. These are people who started drawing pictures of goofy tanks and dwarf soldiers 15 years ago and refused to let the idea die. The game might take until 2028 or later. The communication needs to improve. The scope is ambitious for 3 developers. All of that is true. But the design philosophy is sound, the mechanical ambition is real, and the community response tells you that people have been waiting for exactly this kind of project. The Kickstarter link is in the description and it's pinned in the comments. If you've been waiting for an RTS that respects the classics but isn't content to just copy them, D.O.R.F might be what you've been looking for. Back it. This has been Critical Moves. Thanks for watching.